First letter to the Corinthians.
Blessed be the God and Father of our chapter 1 and verse 3. Fight the good fight. Timothy chapter 6 and verse 2. And our subject is the kindness of the social laws of Israel. Well, we have no intention of going through all the civil or case laws of Israel, but just looking at a number of them in this 21st chapter to note some of their characteristics. And then we shall move on further into the book of Exodus. Here are the civil laws, quite separate from the Ten Commandments, of course, though some of them elaborate upon the Ten Commandments and show, as we often say, the scope of the Ten Commandments. For example, we find in this very chapter that the murder sin is the chief or the head of a family of sins. And among the sins in that family are kidnap and slavery, taking not merely a person's life, but their liberty and their freedom, and subjecting them to a forced labour existence. And various other sins are subdivisions or sub-sins of the great murder sin, which is the chief sin in that particular family. And we see how Moses demonstrates that in these civil laws, as we're given further detail. So they, to some extent, elaborate some of the Ten Commandments. But they are civil and social rules for that particular society. And the society was a church as well as a state. A state, yes, and God had a special covenant relationship with that state. And they were also people taught to worship, taught to seek after God. How many of them generally did so? Well, not very many at all, it turns out, in this generation. However, they are a typical church. They typify the true church of God. Nevertheless, they themselves are a very imperfect society. And so some of these rules and some of these provisions are framed for an imperfect society. And they contain measures which surprise us. And we say, well, surely such and such a misconduct should have been banned altogether. And we find instead of being banned altogether, there is a law made or rule which simply limits the damage of that misbehavior. So you can see they are shaped often for a very imperfect society. However, all the laws of Israel, though they do not directly apply to us in our church or in our civil society, they are all valuable to learn from because of what the confessions, the 17th century confessions of faith, all called their general equity, that is, their general fairness, reflects the principles of God and his own nature. So we can learn from them. And some of them, well, the lessons are very obvious, and some of them, the lessons apply very much to us in our generation, in our civil lives. So we'll look at some of these. Now, verse 1, these are the judgments which thou shalt set before them. They're called here judgments. This is not the only reason, but misconduct or civil disputes that fall foul of these rules will be settled by judges. Judges will watch over them in these matters. So they're described in our King James Version as judgments. Some of them seem very unfair. Rather than fair and just, they seem unfair and harsh. And that is because we don't understand them. And that is because as we read them, we misunderstand the provision. Or we are not seeing the rule in the context of another passage which explains it further. And when we do that, we say, what seemed at first unfair we can now see was not unfair at all, but extraordinarily kind. So we'll look at them, because some of them trouble you. But most of them have so much kindness and fairness in them for the regulation of society. So this is rather an unusual study, but we are now about to look at a set of rules which do not apply to us, not directly anyway, in order to learn their value and learn their kindness and learn something from them. Verse 2, if thou buy an Hebrew servant or slave, let's not mince matters, 6 years he shall serve, and in the 7th he shall go out free for nothing. But that actually is not the whole story, as we shall see. 6 years is the maximum that a slave will serve. What a wonderful society. Slavery is not abolished altogether. In fact, people go into servitude for various reasons in this society of old. They're heavily in debt. Who's going to clear their debts? Who's going to help them? They haven't managed in future days, not of course when they're in the wilderness, but in future days these rules will apply to a society that's divided up into territories, and each family has its small holding, its piece of ground, and it may be that somebody is irresponsible or inadequate, and their small holding fails, and they don't learn a trade properly, or they fail in that, and they cannot support their family, and there is debt and offence, and what will happen is that they will have to accept servitude, a form of slavery in another family, and they'll have to have somebody settle their debts or pay with their liberty. That was the system. There was no social security beyond that. I'm sure families helped each other as much as possible. But then there were offences. There were no prisons in those earliest times either. And there were serious offences, and you had to pay for committing that offence. And we'll go on to that in a few moments. And one of the ways in which you may have to pay is to accept servitude or slavery. And it was your punishment. And so it had not only a penalty for failure, but also for offences. If thou buy an Hebrew servant, 6 years he shall serve. So that's the maximum, no longer. That's an extraordinary thing, really. And it must have written a great deal on the minds of the people. You couldn't say to yourself, he's a slave, she's a slave. She is an inferior caste, an inferior grade. He's a nobody. I am somebody. I have land and status and a trade, and that person is decidedly inferior. But you always knew in the back of your mind that in 6 years' time, in the 7th year, that wouldn't be true anymore. Because the law of God said, no, he's a man and a woman in the sight of God, even having committed offences or having become destitute and unable to support his family. Those people are the same as you. We are all equal. And there will come a time when there must be liberty given, and not only liberty, but as we'll read elsewhere, that person must be set up with cattle and provisions and everything needed to start afresh and to restart somewhere with a bit of land, a small holding perhaps, and the means of support of the family, and everything begins again. So there was it was a great antidote to the caste system. And then, although this doesn't sound very often, not only was there a release after every 6 years of service, but every 50 years in the history of ancient Israel, there was the Jubilee year, when all the slaves went free. I don't know who did the housework and looked after the cattle and the sheep. Well, the rich man had to now do it himself. He lost all his servants at a stroke in the Jubilee year, and the whole of society was regulated. People say, oh, how can you make society more equally? They did it at a stroke every Jubilee year. And it said to the people, there is a new start, There is a fresh start for everybody. This is the principle of the gospel. It was a type, it was a picture of the mercy and kindness of God. And the slave would go out and be set up, presumably in a home, and with the means to keep somewhere his cattle and so on. Now, that's elaborated on more in Deuteronomy and Leviticus. We'll turn to those passages in a moment. If thou buy an Hebrew servant, 6 years he shall serve, and in the 7th he shall go out free for nothing. He won't have to pay anything. But in fact, as we learn elsewhere, as I've said, his former master will pay him. He'll have a payout. Verse 3, if he came in by himself, he shall go out by himself. If he were married, then his wife shall go out with him, and his family, presumably, if they're also with him in servitude. However, verse 4 strikes us perhaps as being unfair. If his master have given him a wife, and she have borne him sons or daughters, the wife and her children shall be her master's, and he shall go out by himself. What? The word of God sanctioning a forced separation? That a married slave, would, if he wished to take his liberty, would go out by himself, and his wife would have to stay in slavery? Well, you can see some problems with a married man taking his wife when his 6 years were up. You can see some problems because if he's married a wife who was also a slave in that household while he was in slavery or servitude, well, he may have married her, say, 3 months before he was due to be given liberty, and she may have another 4 years to serve. Of course, there has to be some provision. Why, you could see that maybe a lot of slaves would say, oh, you're going out in 3 weeks' time with cattle and sheep and everything and money and perhaps enough to buy a plot of land. Oh, I've got 5 3/4 years to go. Let's get married. What a perfect way out of everything. And I should imagine there would be some phony marriages as well. So there's a provision for that. No. You marry her, you've got to wait for her. And maybe she's there for some offence or for debt. She's been bought out for some reason. So there is a provision here. But maybe a benevolent master might say, off you go, if she only had a year or 2 to go on her, let's call it her contract, though it certainly wasn't a contract. So you can see there has to be some provision. And then verse 5 is not necessarily totally connected to verse 4. It isn't the only remedy for verse 4. The man can go out and he can wait for his wife to come. And that happens in our society today in many instances. Service people and contracted people often cannot live together properly if until their time is completed, and it would have to happen then. But here's the case of somebody who doesn't want to go. He loves his master, his wife, his children. He doesn't think he can manage perhaps or cope. He wants to stay. It's a wonderful home and service, and he can go through a ceremony described there in verses 6, which enable some kind of an oath or pledge whereby he pledges himself to remain in service. But it's not the only option for him. Now let's look at verse 7. If a man sell his daughter to be a maidservant, she shall not go out as the men servants do. Some people think that that means that a woman didn't have the same right of release after 6 years' service as a man. But quite plainly, she did, because Leviticus tells us men and women the same, and so does Deuteronomy, have the same right of release after 6 years in the 7th year or anniversary. Now, this seventh verse belongs to verse 8. They go together. If a man sell his daughter to be a maidservant, but she's more than a maidservant, she's a wife. Because we read on, she shall not go out as the men servants do, if she please not her master, who hath betrothed her to himself. That's why she was bought, to be a wife. Then shall he let her be redeemed. Now here's the case of an unscrupulous man who loved a young woman and purchased her. Well, if that happens and she's bought as a servant in order for him to marry her, says the scripture elsewhere, that will be like a dowry, and she will be his wife, and she'll have dignity and honor, not be treated like a servant. But she was bought as a servant. But she can't go after 6 years because she's also his wife. She's been purchased in order not to be really a servant, but a wife. But her husband, who said he loved her and liked her very much, and I must have this young woman to be my wife, he's changed his mind. And it looks from the narrative as though he's changed his mind unjustly. He doesn't want her anymore. There's something in her he dislikes. He's making a mountain out of a molehill, perhaps, instead of coming to terms with it and continuing his affection towards her. We know this is the case because the end of verse 8 says, seeing he hath dealt deceitfully with her. He told her he loved her, and then 5 minutes later he doesn't love her. He wants to dispose of her, get rid of her. So if she please not her master, he sees evil in her, is literally the Hebrew, who hath betrothed her to himself, then shall he let her be redeemed. In other words, someone else pay for her. To sell her unto a strange nation to foreigners, he shall have no power. He's restricted from doing that. So there's kindness in the provision. And if, verse 9, he bought her not for himself, but to betroth her unto his son, he shall deal with her after the manner of daughters. She has dignity. She's not to be sold now. Verse 10, if he take him another wife, well, he shouldn't do that. But if he does do that, because that was happening in that mixed multitude, that unworthy society, so richly blessed, but many of the people kept their practices. If he take him another wife, her food, that is the young woman who was purchased as a servant, her food, her raiment, and her duty of marriage, her full marital rights, shall he not diminish. Well, he won't want that. He wants to be unfaithful to her. He wants another wife. He doesn't want to be forced to do that. So what is the way out? Verse 11, and if he do not these three, all the provisions that Moses had listed, then shall she go out free without money. That is, she won't have to pay, or anyone else shall go out free. And most of the old writers think that she would now be going out as on slave release. So he'd have to provide cattle and provisions, or a place for her to live and look after her also, though that isn't actually stated. So, in the regulation of this wayward society, you can see provisions there which are very kind. And what starts to look uncomfortable actually is full of regulations which are for the kind outworking of the whole situation. And then I go down to verse 12. Here's another set of regulations. He that smiteth a man so that he die shall be surely put to death. Now we puzzle over why, and it's clear in the Hebrew, Modern versions tend to throw this little word surely out. They say it's superfluous. But it's actually very important. He shall surely put to death. Death is the punishment. There is no substitute. Surely he will be put to death. And you'll see this comes up again in verse 15. He that smiteth his father or his mother shall be surely put to death. And yet again in verse 16. He that stealeth a man, he shall surely be put to death. And verse 17. The one who curses, insults father or mother so that they're distraught and they have their self-respect and happiness torn away from them. Even that, to be deprived of your well-being and all your happiness by somebody, is in the murder family of sins. And such a person shall surely be put to death. Why all the surelys? He shall definitely be put to death. Well, anticipating something we'll be looking at in a few moments, when you come to the law of retaliation, eye for an eye, tooth for tooth, there are no surelys. Because in all probability, no one ever lost an eye for depriving someone else of an eye. That was never applied literally. There's very little sign of it in the Bible. But eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth was interpreted by the judges, no doubt at Moses' direction, but there's no record of this, rather as ox for an ox was, that the value of that injury can be settled in money terms. But if it's something that warrants death, he will surely be put to death. The literal follow-through of the punishment is emphasized especially. Anyway, we'll come to that because it's a very interesting point that generally in the Bible there are no maiming punishments. And eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth was settled in value terms. And there are a number of hints of that, even though there is no hard evidence of that. Well, I come down to verse 12 once again. He that smiteth a man so that he die shall be surely put to death. Verse 13, and if a man lie not in wait, but God deliver him into his hand, and how this may happen is spelled out elsewhere. We will just look at it quickly in a number of ways. For instance, if a man, he may be very careless and very foolish, he throws a stone, a rock. Maybe he's trying to disturb the birds in his crops or something like that. Maybe he's trying, because this happened in ancient times, he hasn't got a sheepdog, he's throwing a stone to try and guide some wayward little clump of sheep. So he's throwing a stone. And there's somebody there behind a bush and he doesn't know. And the man is struck by the stone and he dies. Something like that is, well, almost spelled out as an example. Then this applies here, verse 13. If a man lie not in wait, it wasn't an ambush, it wasn't deliberate, but nevertheless somebody died at his hand. God deliver him into his hand. Then I will appoint thee a place whither he shall flee. This is the cities of refuge, which were in due course to be designated when they came into the land. So he can flee to a designated city where members of the family who may be furious and filled with vengeance cannot kill him, and he will be judged in that city by the judges. But verse 14, if a man come presumptuously upon his labour to slay him with guile, thou shalt take him from mine altar, even if he seeks refuge in a place of worship, that he may die. And then verse 15, this surprises us. He that smiteth his father or his mother shall be surely put to death. Now this smiting must be very severe, no doubt. But what a terrible thing to do, to so bully and hurt and destroy as I said before, the self-respect, the dignity, the happiness of parents. Well, to do that deliberately wasn't equal to murder, but it was in the murder family of sins, shall be surely put to death. So to give honour where it's due and to treat people with kindness and respect, that's what's behind the ancient law. Then, as we mentioned, slavery, verse 16, he that stealeth a man and selleth him, or if he be found in the act with a man in his hand, that's under the death penalty of ancient times, and the cursing of father and mother, all those things. Well, dear friends, I go down to verse 18. If men strive together, and one smite another with a stone or with his fist, and he die not, but keepeth his bed, if he rise again and walk abroad upon his staff, that doesn't mean he's hobbling, doesn't mean upon his crutch, that he's half disabled. They always had a staff. It's just a picture of the man able to walk about and tend his sheep, his cattle, whatever. Then shall he that smote him be quit. In other words, he won't have to die. Only he shall pay for the loss of his time. Maybe he was out of action for some time. He must be compensated. Or shall cause him to be thoroughly healed. Pay for whatever care is necessary. The fairness which is displayed in these regulations, and it's so important they apply to us, dear friends. We're to be a fair people. What you like at home? If you're a youngster, you finished education, still at home, and how do you behave? Do you take your share? Do you pay your way as far as you can? I know there's very heavy burdens these days with student debt and so on. There are many youngsters have just assumed there's nothing to pay. It's home. There's nothing to do. It's home. I can behave at 25 just like I did when I was 12. You know, there's no fair play. We can be young adult, a tremendous burden, and doing not a thing, or only one or two things that we happen to like doing now and then. The fairness which is all over these rules. You must compensate, you must pay up, you must be fair, and you must be sensitive to these things. And if you're not, there are the regulations, and you can be referred to the district judge for some penalty or for some compensation. So God desires among his people fairness, and so you read it into all these regulations and rules. And verse 20, if a man smite his servant or his maid with a rod, and he die under his hand, it's murder. Oh, I was only punishing. I was very angry, but you've murdered a person. So there in the rule, it prevents bullying by the superior to the inferior, throwing their weight around unnecessarily. Verse 21, notwithstanding if he continue a day or two, doesn't mean if he continues a day or two and then dies, it means if he's all right, he's not badly injured. The person shall not be punished. And then verse 22, if men strive and hurt a woman with child, so that her fruit depart from her, which means premature birth, and yet no mischief follow, that means the child survives and is all right and lives, he shall be surely punished according as the woman's husband will lay upon him, and he shall pay as the judges determine. And if any mischief follow, the child dies, then thou shalt give life for life. And then comes the law of retribution. And it's not only here, but it's in two, possibly three other passages of Scripture also. Eye for eye, tooth for tooth, it's verse 24, hand for hand, foot for foot, burning for burning, wound for wound, stripe for stripe, the law of retribution. But as I said earlier, there's quite good evidence that this was not literally put into practice, but the value was obviously. If you have to compensate somebody for losing an eye so that he can't pursue his trade as a skilled craftsman or carpenter, that's an expensive compensation. Whereas a tooth won't be anything like as expensive. So the law of retribution is not as horrific as it sounds to us, because actually it is just simply the principle the punishment must fit the crime. The compensation must fit the offence and the loss. But it's all in the interests of care and a fair society. Verse 26, and if a man smite the eye of his servant or the eye of his maid, that it perish, he shall let him go free for his eye's sake. And not only that, but of course, if the servant, the slave, goes free, he's got to be provided for. Oh, but the 6 years are not expired. The owner may protest. No, but you've brought about a release because of your treatment, and so you must provide. And verse 27, if he smite out his manservant's tooth or his maidservant's tooth, he shall let him go free for his tooth's sake. That's not a bad deal, is it? I've only served 2 months of my 6 years, and he took a swing at me and knocked a tooth out. I'm free. That's good. So it's a kind provision in that case. Verse 28, if an ox gore a man or a woman that they die, then the ox shall be surely stoned, and his flesh shall not be eaten. But the owner of the ox shall be quit. Don't hold him responsible, although later on it does say that there are circumstances under which he may have to pay a lot of compensation, but he won't be responsible by having to be punished with death. But the ox will be in effect punished. Well, of course he must be, because he might be a violent animal that will do it again. And his meat won't be eaten. Nobody must profit from this dreadful thing, because life is so precious, and it's a great tragedy, and the people are learning that life is precious. What a terrible thing to then feast on the ox after it's caused that. But verse 29, if the ox were wont to push or butt with his horn in time past, in other words, this particular ox has form, and it hath been testified to his owner, the owner knows the ox is apt to do this kind of thing, and he hath not kept him in, but that he hath killed a man or a woman, the ox shall be stoned, and the owner also shall be put to death. Carelessness that leads to death. When you know your ox can do that, or any other animal come to that, is still a capital offence. So carelessness that brings hurt and ruin to others is seen as a great crime, a great sin. Can I apply that spiritually? I hope you don't find it far-fetched. I don't think it is. But when you're in the office or in some similar situation and you're working, and some very irritating situation arises, do you lose your cool and snap at and lose your temper, say with an unbeliever, and speak unreasonably and excessively? Do you do that? and blight your testimony so they'll never listen to you, and you never receive a word of salvation from your lips because of your conduct. Careless talk. Why? You see, God's will in olden times, even the careless, thoughtless, heedless, inconsiderate keeper of a violent animal is responsible for the consequences and the death. And we're dealing with souls. And we can leave a trail of damage behind us in life. People who've judged our message and our Lord and our gospel by our conduct. These laws speak to us too, even though we may not have a violent ox. You may have an untamable tongue and do great damage. And you think to yourself, well, the way God administers his law, I am responsible. The anger of God may be toward me for this. I must buckle up and be more considerate and more careful and think of the consequences of my different actions. Am I being unfair to apply it in that way? The principle is there. Verse 30, if there be laid on him a sum of money, this is the owner of the violent ox, then he shall give for the ransom of his life whatsoever is laid upon him. There you see a little sign of how the law was surely applied, the law of retribution. Eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth. A sum of money is laid by the judges instead. It can be done here, in this case, because the owner didn't murder himself. It was his ox. He's responsible. He's under the death sentence, but he can have a compensatory payment, which will be very big, instead. So there were some of the sentences, you see, little bits of evidence like this, could be expressed in terms of compensation. And verse 31, but time is rushing on. Whether he have gored a son or have gored a daughter, according to this judgment, shall it be done unto him. The little children are just as important. You can't say, oh, that child runs everywhere. That child maybe was harassing the ox, taunting it in some way. Doesn't matter. The owner is responsible. If he knew that ox had a bad temper, then the irritability of the child is no excuse. A child's life is precious. And so the owner of the ox, well, he's responsible. And yet, again, I apply the principle behind it. We have churches where they say, no, whatever you say, we're not going to start a Sunday school. We're not going to get into that. It's too much hassle for us. We're not concerned about the job. We're concerned about them, but it's not our role. We can't cope with that. And yet the children are vitally important. And if the ox gored a child that maybe you could argue partly responsible, no consideration to that, the owner, the careless, thoughtless owner, is responsible. In his selfishness, because he wouldn't pen the ox or pay for that, he's responsible. And then same with verse 33. We're almost at the end. If a man shall open a pit, or if a man shall dig a pit and not cover it, and an ox or an ass fall therein, the owner of the pit shall make it good, and give money unto the owner of them, and the dead beast shall be his. I won't go into the details of that, but as you look to the end of the passage, then there are the laws of compensation worked out in greater detail. Fairness is throughout these social laws. Carelessness is punished. We're responsible for all our actions before God, especially as Christians. In the church, never defraud each other. Always look out for each other. Always be aware of the effects of your actions. Some people, they say, I want to teach in the Sunday school. I want to drive people, children, to the meetings in the week. I want to make myself available for these tasks. And then they're forever ringing up on the slightest pretext and saying, I don't feel so well tonight. I'm not coming in. Well, sometimes you have to do that. You really aren't well. But there are some dear friends who do it so easily that they're possibly only on parade 30% of the time, 25% of the time. What's that to do with our passage? Well, this is all about fairness, compensating each other, being sensitive and careful, not being unaware of the effects of our conduct so that there's hurt in society. And it's so with us. We've got to be sensitive and conscientious and careful and do our utmost. Some people never engage in Christian service. They love the Lord. They pray for the work. They are, some can't, but they are available, but they don't make themselves available. These are the laws of fair play and fairness, and saying, I must help, otherwise other people have too great burdens to bear. I must do my best. I don't mean to speak reprovingly. I think this is a wonderful fellowship, and so very many people are forward and available. So I really am not getting at anything or anyone. I'm only putting before you these ancient civil laws that are full of fair play, responsible for action, for our actions and so on. And we apply that to ourselves spiritually. The object is there'll be no bitterness in society, no wrongs that are not set right, no selfishness, but peace and harmony and working together. And that's the object of these civil regulations. That's the mind of the Lord, to achieve those things. And those are the very things that we want to achieve also in our fellowship and in our service for Christ. That's enough for us this evening. I won't do any more of those complex laws, but it's an insight.